Welcome to the lecture on introducing organic compounds. When we look at living things are organic. They are built from organic compounds. And when you look at organic compounds in life, there are four major classes of macromolecule that all living things are built from. The two lectures after this are going to look in detail at those four major types of macromolecules. This chapter is going to, or this lecture I should say, is going to introduce what organic compounds are and kind of the nature of their structure. So, macromolecules. It's a word you're going to run into throughout these three lectures. Macro means large, and so macromolecules, at least on a molecular scale, are quite enormous. There's a specific method in which they are built, which we'll get into in a little bit, that allows them to become such large molecules. What are the four types of macromolecules that build organic compounds? What is an organic compound anyway? We'll answer that one in just a little bit. Well, let's first look at the four types of macromolecules. So the last couple PowerPoints dealt with the chemistry of life, right? How atoms interact to form molecules. Well, we've got four classes of macromolecule here. First one we've got up on the screen. There's a number of food items here. We have pasta, potatoes, corn, bananas, apricots, honey, bread. All delicious stuff that has a lot of carbs. Carbohydrates are one class of macromolecule that is found in living things. Another one, we have several different nut varieties up here. I see cashews, almonds, and pecans, for instance. Nuts are high in fats, and fats are a type of lipid. Lipids are another class of macromolecule. Here we have a chicken. Chicken, if you consume it, is very high in protein. Proteins are another class of macromolecule. You are built primarily from proteins. And then the one over on the left is DNA, which is a type of nucleic acid. You, of course, have DNA in virtually all of your cells, not quite all of them, but almost all of them. And so these four are the four major types of macromolecules. If you were to look at your body, your cells are built from these four macromolecules, and there's a lot of variety within, especially, for instance, in proteins, which we'll look at in another upcoming lecture. There is a ton of variety in terms of the functionality of proteins. But there's also a similarity in the way that they're built that makes them a protein, so we'll get to all that. But these are the four major macromolecules that construct or build living organisms. All of them are organic. So what does this mean? Organic is a very broad term in everyday usage. It is open to a lot of interpretation. And that's a good thing if you're somebody who's trying to sell something that is organic, because it can really mean whatever you want it to mean. So here is a cartoon, got USDA organic, super organic, organic ultra, mega organic, organic classic. I'm sure you've seen organic food sections at various grocery stores, and you might wonder, what does this mean? Why is this organic? First thing I notice about organic food is that it's more expensive. Other things you might notice about it might have a label that says no GMO, no pesticides, locally grown, things along those lines. There are a lot of synonyms we think of when we think of organic. We might think healthier. We might think, without any type of, like we said, pesticide or any type of artificial fertilizer, things like that. It's a very, very broad term. Biologically speaking, organic is not that broad. It actually has a very simple meaning. In fact, This is an organic meal, according to biological definitions. We've got some delicious McDonald's fries. It's like, I don't eat McDonald's much. This is some type of double cheeseburger, it looks like. And we have Coke right there. All of that is organic food. Organic simply means that something has carbon and hydrogen in it. If it has carbon and hydrogen in it, biologically speaking, it is organic. Better believe all three of those, fries, the burger, and the soda, they all have carbon and hydrogen. That is a nice organic meal. So whenever you see the word organic, from here on out in this class, don't think of it in terms of everyday usage. Think of it with this specific definition. Living things composed virtually entirely from organic compounds. And even though there is the hydrogen requirement for something to be organic, this is put in there because stuff like CO2 is not organic, right? So we have to put a little hydrogen disclaimer in there that it's got to be around to have something be organic as well. But here's the real important part, the carbon. Usually that's what people focus on biologically to make something organic. It has carbon. Because of that, it is often said that life is carbon-based. The bulk of material matter in living organisms consists of carbon, lots of associated hydrogens, and a couple other commonly occurring elements. If you remember from the last couple lectures, oxygen and nitrogen are going to be pretty abundant in life, but there's also going to be phosphorus, sulfur, and other such things associated as well. So most organic compounds involve kind of this skeleton of carbons. If I can make a C that actually looks like a C. There we go. Most organic compounds consist of a skeleton of carbon atoms with various other elements bonded to those carbons. Lots of hydrogens. Occasionally other such things like oxygen. Perhaps nitrogen. And we've got an organic molecule. I honestly don't know what that is, but that is an organic molecule. Carbons with associated hydrogens, oxygen, nitrogen as well, occasionally less common elements like sulfur, phosphorus. Life is generally said to be carbon-based. I want you to notice the lines that I drew. Just to rehash, those lines represent bonds. Specifically, if you remember the type of bond, they are covalent bonds. And one line represents a pair of shared electrons. And so there's a pair of electrons shared between this carbon and this hydrogen, and it's represented with the line. One of the examples we used before was H2O, right? Same principle, you're seeing the structural formula of both of those here and here. If you remember from before, double bonds do exist. Carbon dioxide, for instance, there's double bonds between the carbon and the two oxygens that it's bonded to. That means there's two pairs of electrons being shared and not just one. Notice how carbon always has 4 lines, 4 bonds that it's forming. That's because carbon needs 4 electrons to become stable, and so it always, virtually always, forms 4 bonds in order to achieve that stability. So just an FYI with that. So those are organic, that is the definition of an organic compound. Let's look at one class of organic compound that you don't see very much, called the hydrocarbons. It's, as the name would imply, hydrogen and carbon are involved. But this is an exclusive group. The hydrocarbons include only carbon and hydrogen. So this thing over here that I drew, this organic molecule, this organic compound, not a hydrocarbon, because we've got the O and the N, and another O. But if it's got only C and H, it's a hydrocarbon. For instance, I'm sure most of you at some point in life have heard of methane. That's methane. It's one C and four H's bonded to it. That's an example of a hydrocarbon. It's just carbon and hydrogen. In living things, which is what this class is concerned with, pure hydrocarbons like this are pretty darn rare. You just don't see a complete lack of oxygen, nitrogen, or other such elements in living tissues. It's just not, you don't see it. Where do you find hydrocarbons then? Well, you usually find them in the remains of organisms that have long since died. You find them in fossil fuels. You find them in petroleum, oils. Gasoline is principally composed of various hydrocarbons. You can see there the oil extraction and the gasoline pump. So we aren't going to talk much about these, since they're not found in life very much. But what features do they have in common? Well, we use them for gasoline, very flammable, high energy bonds, also hydrophobic, so you can't mix gas with water. If you remember from a few lectures back, carbon and hydrogen both have very little pull on the electrons that they're sharing. This is called electronegativity. And so since both carbon and hydrogen have low electronegativity, they share electrons equally, and they are called a nonpolar molecule when they're together. This is nonpolar. So are other hydrocarbons. For instance, if you had 3 carbons back with all of the associated hydrogens as well, now you have propane. That's another hydrocarbon. So they're nonpolar, which makes them hydrophobic. They don't mix with water. They're very flammable, and there's a lot of energy in the bonds of hydrocarbons. When you burn hydrocarbons, you're releasing the stored energy, and it's released in the form of carbon dioxide. And so that is why burning fossil fuels increases CO2 amounts in our atmosphere and contributes to climate change. Okay, so hydrocarbons don't occur very much in life. What we usually see is we don't see just carbons and hydrogens like this. We see stuff like what I drew over here. We see molecules that have other elements attached to a skeleton of carbon and hydrogen. For example, this is called ethane. It is a hydrocarbon. But if we add something here, we add an O and an H to the end of it, it is no longer ethane, it is now ethanol, which is an alternative fuel and also a byproduct of fermentation that gives alcoholic drinks, the properties that they have in affecting human behavior in certain ways. So, this thing that I made in red, this is an example of what's called a functional group. A functional group is a group of atoms that, when you put them with a larger section of a molecule, they affect the properties of that entire molecule to which they are attached. A good analogy, I think, is prefixes and suffixes. So let's say that the verb we're going to look at is do. If I add a prefix to that, redo, that has now changed the meaning of the entire word. I could add a different prefix. Undo. We've changed the meaning of the word again. We could add a suffix as well. Now it's something that's happening currently, doing. All of those prefixes and suffixes are analogous to functional groups. You latch them on to theoretically what would be a much larger word. Do is pretty small, but you latch a prefix or a suffix onto a larger word and it changes the meaning of the whole word. Likewise, a functional group is latched onto a much larger skeleton of carbons and hydrogens, and that functional group changes the properties of that entire molecule. So here is all of that typed up on the PowerPoint. Certain groups of atoms frequently occur together in a particular arrangement. For instance, the O and the H. These groups, these arrangements that we see, are called functional groups. And what they do is they bond to a skeleton of carbons and hydrogens, and then that has a particular effect on the carbon and hydrogen skeleton to which it attaches. It changes the properties of the entire molecule. For instance, the OH that we have here, that is called a hydroxyl functional group. And what it does is it turns molecules into alcohols. And that's not just the drinking type of alcohol, which is actually contains ethanol, but that includes rubbing alcohols, alcohols that are preservatives. That hydroxyl group, anytime it's added onto another molecule, turns it into alcohols. One other example would be, I don't know how many of you have heard of something called methanol. So methane is this. But if we add the hydroxyl functional group, now it is methanol. I don't know the technicalities of how making moonshine works, but in the process of actually making the drinkable alcohol, some of this is made, and if it's made poorly, if the alcohol is made poorly, some of this remains. And if you consume too much of this, it eats away at your optic, leads the optic nerve, and it causes blindness. So if you're going to make moonshine, do it right. Another functional group is called the carboxyl group. And this one turns molecules into acids. The carboxyl functional group is this. So if you latch that onto something, it tends to make what you latch it onto an acidic molecule. For instance, here is our basic template of carbon and hydrogen. If we latch on carboxyl group, we now have acetic acid, aka vinegar. Vinegar is quite diluted, but it contains acetic acid. And then we've got, you can probably barely see it, but this is a picture of some incredibly delicious looking General Tso's chicken. Chicken has a lot of protein in it. Proteins are actually built from building blocks called amino acids. So if you want to get your amino acids, you consume protein in order to get those because it's built from them. And the generic amino acid structure, which you'll learn a lot more about later on, looks like this. This is one amino acid right here. The R group is something we'll talk about later, so ignore that for now. But look on both sides of the amino acid. You've got the carbon and hydrogen in the middle. You've got the carboxyl group over here. That's this one, which means the acid part of the name comes from the fact that it has this functional group, which makes it acidic. On this side, we've got the N and the H's. That is called an amino group. And so, hence, it's called an amino acid. Usually, amino groups actually give whatever they latch onto a basic or alkaline quality. But just be aware that there are different functional groups. The carboxyl and the hydroxyl are the two that I would really want you to be aware of. If you're wondering how big of an impact they can have, here is an example of that. These are two lions, obviously. The one on the left, a male lion, the one on the right, a female lion. There are a number of different external sexual characteristics that distinguish male and female lions, but the mane is, of course, the most well-known one. Part of what contributes to the development of male physical characteristics is the presence and the abundance of testosterone that is present during development. We have two molecules here. If you're unfamiliar with what this is trying to show, anytime you don't see anything labeled, it's just assume that there's a carbon there with a bunch of hydrogens with it. So here's a carbon, here's a carbon, here's a carbon. There's a bunch of hydrogens with it. I just want you to be aware of what you're seeing when you see something like this. So this is showing two different examples of steroids in the body. This is testosterone, it is a type of steroid. And I believe this one is estradiol, which is a type of estrogen. Look at how similar they are. The general layout of those molecules is very, very similar. But the one on the left has a few different functional groups than the estradiol on the right. So in testosterone, we've got a hydroxyl group here. This one's called a methyl functional group. Here's a methyl functional group, and here's something called a carbonyl group. Don't worry about memorizing those names, you don't have to know them. But just notice how it's a couple of functional groups that we have over here that are different from what we have in the estradiol here. Here's a hydroxyl. There's no methyl group here. and there's a couple extra double bonds. Minor molecular differences, at least to our eyes. But look at the different effect, ultimately, that these two molecules have on the development of the male and female individuals in question. So testosterone, a type of estrogen over here, very similar, but a couple functional groups being different is responsible for the very different properties that we see them producing in the male and female individuals. So this is kind of a repeat of what we started with. The 4 classes of macromolecules: carbs, proteins, and there's some more General Tso's chicken. I was very hungry when I made this. Nucleic acids and lipids. Again, they're called macromolecules because on a molecular scale, these guys are quite large. So then the question is, how do they get so big? How are we able to produce such large molecules? I want you to think of a fence. I want you to think of a small fence, like a picket fence or something like that. Here's one section of it. There's our little section of fence. Small. Well, a fence consists of a large number of repeating individual subunits that continue on for as long as it needs to. But this can go several thousand sections longer in either direction. And we started with a small little piece of fence, one building block, and you turn it into this massive, long chain. That is the same way in which at least 3 of our macromolecules are going to be built. Carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids. So lipids are the one that is excluded from this, the way that these are built. Carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids are called polymers. Poly, the word poly, means many. Mono, the root mono means one. So, carbs, proteins, nucleic acids consist of single building blocks called monomers. A monomer would be a single piece of the fence. When you string them all together and get the entire chain of monomers linked together, you get what's called a polymer. Poly again means many. So, individual monomers linked together form polymers. Let's start with proteins. Proteins are a polymer, right? They're a very long chain. What is the building block of a protein? What is the single piece that gets strung together to make a protein? That would be our amino acids. You guys remember what one of those is? Just drew it a little while ago. Looks like that. Carboxyl group here, amino group here, the whole shebang is one amino acid. And so when you eat protein, you're actually eating millions of these bonded together in that protein polymer. Very, very long chain. How do you join them together? How do you join multiple, for instance, amino acids together. Let's say you go to the gym, you do some bicep curls, and you want that bicep muscle to grow. What do you need to consume in order for it to grow? You need to consume protein. Why? So that the protein you eat ultimately gets broken down and then sent to your repairing muscle as molecules used to build up new muscle tissue. Because your muscle is made of protein also. So you consume some protein source, your body breaks it down, and now you have a bunch of amino acids that your body needs to link together to build up the protein in your muscle tissue. How does your body link together individual ones of these, individual amino acids, together to make the protein, for instance, of your bicep muscle? It does it using something called a dehydration reaction. So let's just show how that works. It's easier shown than just said. So this is one amino acid. I'm going to draw another one. So you've consumed, so we'll say General Tso's chicken, since that's where my mind is at. You've consumed some General Tso's chicken. Your body broke down the proteins in that chicken. And now you've got some individual amino acids that ultimately came from the chicken that you ate. Your body needs to join them together to build your muscle tissue to repair that bicep that is torn from when you worked out. How are we going to join these together? What we're going to do is pluck out a water molecule. So, one amino acid, you look at the carboxyl end and take out O and the H. On the other amino acid, you look on the amino end and you take out the H. Last I checked, that gives us H2O. And these guys are gone. Carbon, over here, only has 3 bonds formed at this moment. Nitrogen only has 2. If we join them together, now this carbon and this nitrogen are stable. Everybody's stable again. You removed a single water molecule, and we join together the neighboring amino acids. Do this thousands upon thousands of times, and you will build up that bicep muscle tissue, hopefully bigger than it was before. But you have to consume enough protein to have the amino acids to build it. So how does it work? Dehydration reaction is so named because it involves the loss of a water molecule, which frees atoms from the neighboring monomers. Again, this is one monomer, amino acid. This is another one, the other amino acid. Dehydration reaction frees up molecules to link together. Building muscle is one example of how that would work. The formation of potatoes in an actual potato plant would be another. Plants produce glucose. Glucose is a single sugar. And starch in potatoes is actually a very, very long chain of glucose repeating over and over and over and over again. So when a plant does photosynthesis, it produces the glucose, the individual sugar, and then it takes that and it links together all of those individual sugars and stores it as starch. When we eat potatoes, our body then breaks those individual glucoses apart in the digestive process. Speaking of which, there's a term for that. The term is hydrolysis. This literally means splitting water. So hydrolysis is used to break apart long chains into smaller segments. For instance, you eat McDonald's fries, that's a lot of starch. Your body has to break that long chain of starch down into the individual glucose molecules. It's exactly the reverse of the dehydration reaction. So let's say that you've eaten General Tso's chicken, and this is part of that long chain of amino acids that makes up the chicken's protein. Your body is going to perform hydrolysis by the addition of a water molecule, which is used to break apart the bond between the two neighboring amino acids. The H's, the hydrogens, and the oxygen atoms separate with one oxygen and one hydrogen joining over here. The other hydrogen joins over here. We have successfully split apart our polymer into individual monomers. That is how polymers and monomers are built and broken apart. The next lecture will look specifically at two different types of macromolecule, and then the one after that will look at the other two types.